The Thing on the Doorstep, extended version. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. It all began in the decayed and legend-haunted city of Arkham, where I, Daniel Upton, first met Edward Derby. From childhood, he had been a singularly gifted individual, bright, introspective, and possessed of an imagination too vast for his own sanity. Even as a boy, his stories and strange fancies unsettled those around him. I, being older and perhaps wiser, saw his brilliance as a gift, yet I feared for his mind's fragility. Edward, despite his remarkable intellect, was always somewhat weak-willed. He remained under the watchful eye of his parents for longer than most, never quite able to shake his dependency on their shelter. He dabbled in the macabre, drawn to the forbidden lore that lurked in the Miskatonic library and whispered from the ancient, crumbling tomes of the Necronomicon and Unosprechlichen Kulten. Then came a Senath Waite of Innsmouth. From the moment Edward met her, I felt a darkness descend over him. She was unlike any woman I had ever seen. Her features, while striking, bore the unmistakable taint of the Innsmouth look. Her large, unblinking eyes seemed to peer into one's very soul, and her voice carried an unsettling resonance that chilled even the bravest of men. There was something wrong with Asenath, something deeply unnatural, yet Edward was hopelessly ensnared. Their courtship was brief and troubling. Edward changed after their marriage, his vibrancy dulled, his mind became muddled, and he grew increasingly paranoid. He spoke of lost time, of waking in strange places with no memory of how he had gotten there. His once clear writing became erratic, filled with references to forbidden rituals and unnatural transformations. I suspected something insidious was at work, and my worst fears were confirmed one fateful night. Edward arrived at my home in a state of disarray, his face gaunt and his clothes torn. He spoke in hushed, frantic whispers of a terrible secret, that Asenath was not as she seemed, that she was not wholly human. He babbled about body transference, of stolen identities, and of ancient horrors that lurked beneath the surface of reality. He claimed that Asenath was dead, yet not dead, that she had taken his body for her own nefarious purposes. I dismissed his ravings as the delusions of a troubled mind, but I could not ignore the profound terror in his eyes. A terror that seemed to confirm every whispered rumor about the dark rites of Innsmouth. Then came the final horror. A pounding at my door in the dead of night. A shuffling, unnatural gait upon my threshold. And then, a voice, weak and rasping, yet unmistakably Edward's, pleading for help. I opened the door to a nightmare. What stood before me was a thing that had once been Edward Derby, but was now something else entirely. His body was decayed, his skin pallid and withered, his eyes hollowed and lifeless. And yet, the voice was his, crying out, begging, cursing the entity that had stolen his flesh and left him trapped in a rotting shell. I did what had to be done. The gun was in my hand before I could think, and 6 shots rang out, tearing through the abomination that had once been my friend. It collapsed in a heap upon my doorstep, and as life faded from its wretched form, a final, gurgling whisper escaped its lips. At Kanchaknapong R6F, help me. Now, as I write this, I know that I shall never again know peace. For I have seen beyond the veil of reality. I have glimpsed the horrors that lurk in the shadows, and I know that one day, they shall come for me as they came for Edward. Title: The Turn of the Screw, a Retelling. Chapter 1, Arrival at Bly. It began with a tale told by the firelight, a tale of such spectral weight that it lingered in the air like mist. A governess, young and eager, accepted a post at Bly, a grand yet isolating estate. Her charge was Flora, a child of seraphic innocence, and later, her brother, Miles, unexpectedly returned from school under strange circumstances. Upon arrival, the governess was enthralled by Bly's beauty, yet an undercurrent of unease prickled her senses. Mrs. Groves, the housekeeper, was warm yet cautious. She spoke vaguely of the previous governess, Miss Jessel, and a former valet, Peter Quint, both of whom had met unfortunate ends. The governess felt a deep sense of duty, determined to protect the children from whatever silent ghosts haunted the halls. Chapter 2: The First Apparition. As days turned into weeks, she found herself ensnared in the mysteries of Bly. The children were preternaturally well-behaved, yet something about their perfection unsettled her. One evening, as she strolled across the grounds, she glimpsed a figure atop a tower, a man with piercing eyes and an air of malign intent. When she described him to Mrs. Groves, the housekeeper turned pale. It was Peter Quint. But Peter Quint was dead. Thus began the governess's descent into uncertainty. Were these visions merely figments of her imagination, or did the dead truly linger at Bly? Chapter 3: Miss Jessel Returns. The haunting deepened. Flora, usually sweet-tempered, began to change, her silences grew eerie, her laughter hollow. Then came the night when the governess saw another spectre, a woman in black, weeping at the lake's edge. Miss Jessel. The governess's resolve strengthened. These children were not merely haunted, they were claimed. Quint and Jessel sought to corrupt them beyond death. And yet, Miles and Flora denied everything. Their blank expressions, their calculated charm, it was as if they were already under the spell of these phantoms. Chapter 4: Shadows at Bly. The governess began to feel the weight of her duty more heavily. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind, seemed filled with spectral warnings. Flora started speaking in hushed tones to empty spaces, and Miles began to act with an unsettling wisdom beyond his years. The governess found herself questioning reality, feeling that the very walls of Bly were closing in. One night, she ventured into the darkened corridors and found Miles standing by the window, whispering into the night. When she called his name, he turned slowly, his expression void of childhood innocence. "They are here," he said simply, pointing to the empty air behind her. Chapter 5: The Gathering Storm. The governess was determined, she could no longer ignore the truth. She confronted Mrs. Groves, demanding to know more about Quint and Jessel's influence over the children. Mrs. Groves hesitated, then admitted in a fearful whisper that the two had been too close to the children in life. Now, in death, their presence was even stronger. The apparitions grew bolder. Miss Jessel appeared to Flora in broad daylight by the lake, and the girl smiled. Quint's shadow loomed in Miles's room, and the boy did not scream. The governess made a decision: she would break the children free, no matter the cost. Chapter 6: The Final Confrontation. Flora was taken away by Mrs. Groves, leaving only the governess and Miles at Bly. The house fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the ticking of the great clock in the hall. That night, the governess found Miles in the study, sitting motionless in a chair. "Where is Peter Quint?" she demanded. Miles's lips curled into a knowing smile. "He is here. Watching. Waiting." The air grew cold, the candles flickered. The governess turned, and saw him. Peter Quint, his form wreathed in shadow, his eyes burning with unnatural light. He stepped forward, reaching for Miles. With a cry, the governess seized the boy, shielding him. You will not have him. The room shuddered, the glass in the windows cracked, and then, the silence returned. Miles slumped against her. She called his name. He did not answer. Epilogue. The tale ended as it began, in the flickering light of a fire, leaving its audience shrouded in unease. Had the governess saved Miles, or had she been the true source of his doom? The story, like the ghosts of Bly, refused to rest. And so, the legend continued, whispered in darkened corridors and passed down through generations, a warning against unseen terrors and the fragile boundary between innocence and corruption. The turn of the screw was complete, winding ever tighter, trapping all who dared to listen within its spectral grasp. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. Title: The Invisible Man, a Retelling. Chapter 1: The Mysterious Stranger. On a bitterly cold February evening, a strange man arrived at the Coach and Horses Inn in the quiet village of Iping. Wrapped in thick garments, his face completely concealed by bandages and dark glasses, he spoke little and demanded privacy. Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, found his manner peculiar but welcomed the guest nonetheless. Despite his reclusiveness, strange occurrences began to unfold. Objects moved on their own, footsteps sounded with no visible source, and the townspeople grew wary. The stranger, though secretive, spent his days conducting scientific experiments in his room, avoiding all unnecessary interactions. Chapter 2: The Experiment Gone Wrong. The stranger's name was Griffin, a former scientist whose obsession with optical refraction led him to discover the secret of invisibility. His experiments had been successful, too successful. He had made himself completely invisible but failed to reverse the process. Desperate, penniless, and growing increasingly unstable, Griffin sought refuge in the isolated village while continuing his research. But his erratic behavior raised suspicion. When Mrs. Hall pressed him about unpaid bills, Griffin's temper flared. In a fit of rage, he revealed his terrible secret by shedding his garments and vanishing before her very eyes. Chapter 3: A Reign of Terror Begins. Now fully exposed as an invisible man, Griffin lashed out against the villagers. He vandalized the inn, terrorized the people, and fled into the countryside. The village of Iping erupted into chaos, with tales of an unseen menace spreading fear among the locals. Seeking an ally, Griffin approached Dr. Kemp, an old acquaintance. He recounted his journey, from his breakthrough in invisibility to his descent into madness. He spoke of his dream to establish a reign of terror, using his invisibility to exert control over others. Chapter 4: The Hunt for the Invisible Man. Horrified by Griffin's ambitions, Dr. Kemp betrayed him, alerting the authorities. A desperate manhunt ensued, with the invisible fugitive striking fear into the hearts of all who pursued him. His unchecked power made him nearly unstoppable until exhaustion, cold, and hunger began to weaken him. The townspeople, now armed with knowledge and determination, set traps and blockades. Griffin's advantage faded. As he tried to escape, they captured him in a final, frantic struggle. In the end, his invisibility proved to be both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. Chapter 5: The Final Stand. In his last attempt to escape, Griffin found himself trapped in an abandoned barn, his body shivering from the cold. He cursed the world that had turned against him, the science that had betrayed him, and the fate that had condemned him to be forever unseen. As dawn broke, the villagers surrounded the barn, closing in from all sides. Griffin, too weak to resist, collapsed onto the cold ground. His body began to fade into sight, first his hands, then his face, until he was fully visible once more. The legend of the Invisible Man came to an end, his genius lost to the very power he had sought to control. Epilogue. With his final breath, Griffin's body slowly reappeared, his secret lost but his legend enduring. His tale remained a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the darkness that lurks within the human mind. The story of the Invisible Man would be told for generations, a cautionary tale whispered in the dead of night. The world would remember his name, his tragedy, and his terrible mistake. But his shadow, unseen and eternal, would always linger. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. Title: The Most Dangerous Game, a Retelling. Chapter 1: The Mysterious Island. The yacht cut through the moonlit waters of the Caribbean, its passengers unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Sanger Rainsford, a skilled hunter, leaned against the railing, discussing the philosophy of hunting with his companion, Whitney. "The world is made up of two classes," he said. "The hunters and the hunted." A sudden sound, a gunshot in the distance, snapped Rainsford's attention to the dark horizon. Moments later, he lost his footing, tumbling into the sea. Struggling against the waves, he swam toward the nearest landmass, a dark, foreboding island. Chapter 2: General Zaroff's Hospitality. Exhausted and soaked, Rainsford stumbled onto the shore. As dawn broke, he followed a trail leading to an opulent chateau deep in the jungle. There, he was greeted by the enigmatic General Zaroff, a refined but unnerving man. Zaroff, a fellow hunter, recognized Rainsford's name and invited him to dinner. As they dined, Zaroff revealed his dark secret: he had grown bored of hunting animals. They no longer presented a challenge. Instead, he had turned to hunting the most cunning and dangerous prey, man. Horrified, Rainsford refused to participate. But Zaroff, amused by his guest's defiance, announced that Rainsford would soon experience the most dangerous game firsthand. Chapter 3: The Hunt Begins. At dawn, Rainsford was given a head start. Armed with only a knife and his wits, he fled into the dense jungle. Zaroff, accompanied by his hulking assistant Ivan and a pack of bloodthirsty hounds, set off in pursuit. Using his survival skills, Rainsford set traps and doubled back on his tracks. But Zaroff was no ordinary hunter. He toyed with his prey, prolonging the game for his own twisted enjoyment. Time was running out, and Rainsford knew that escape was impossible. His only option was to fight. Chapter 4: The Final Confrontation. As night fell, Rainsford executed a desperate plan. He swam around the island and snuck into Zaroff's chateau, waiting in the shadows. When the general returned, satisfied with his supposed victory, Rainsford emerged from the darkness. A fierce battle ensued, the two men fighting for survival. In the end, Rainsford prevailed. Standing over Zaroff's lifeless body, he understood the truth of his own words. The world was indeed made up of hunters and the hunted. Chapter 5: A New Dawn. With Zaroff defeated, Rainsford faced a choice: leave the island behind or take control of its dark legacy. He knew he could never return to the life he once had. Instead, he embraced the primal instincts that had kept him alive, ensuring that no one else would fall victim to the general's twisted game. The island remained silent, its horrors buried in the depths of the jungle. But the legend of Shiptrap Island persisted, whispered among sailors who feared its cursed shores. And somewhere in the shadows, a new hunter watched and waited. Epilogue. The legend of the most dangerous game would never die, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. Rainsford had survived, but he had changed forever. The hunter had become the hunted, and in that transformation he had learned the true nature of fear and power. The game was over, but the island's story would live on. At Kanchaknapong, R6F.